My husband planned the perfect accident to get rid of me for insurance money, but he didn't know I had already changed the beneficiary. When the truth came out, he was the one begging for mercy. Strange, really. How something so unexpected can feel like a sinking ship, the kind that takes everything down with it. That night, when he told me he had something special planned, I had no idea just how deeply I'd fall into the cold, dark water. Our marriage had been crumbling for months. At first, I thought it was just the routine of life settling in. The small disagreements, the silence at dinner, the empty spaces in between our words. But then the distance between us grew like a chasm, a canyon wide enough that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bridge it. I've always had a career that I could be proud of. I've worked hard to build a name for myself, a job I love, with a salary that allows me to enjoy the finer things in life. I don't say that to brag, but because it's part of the story. Part of the reason why our relationship started to feel like a tug of war. He hated how successful I had become. Not because he didn't want me to succeed, but because he felt like he was fading into the background, overshadowed by my accomplishments. At first he tried to hide it. The resentment, the bitter comments here and there, the way he would roll his eyes when I mentioned work. Eventually, it came out in passive-aggressive remarks that stung like paper cuts, little things like, "Must be nice to have everything handed to you," or, "Some people are just lucky." Those comments piled up, and with every passing day, we grew colder toward each other. But that night, everything changed. He walked in after a long day at work, his suit slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened. I had been sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, not really doing anything in particular. He surprised me by saying, "I've made a reservation for dinner. It's a surprise, but I think you'll like it." I looked at him confused. "A dinner? Surprise? Since when do you do surprises?" I asked, skeptical. He never really did. His smile was warm, almost too warm, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just trust me." There was something about the way he said it, too casual, too perfect, that made my stomach churn. But I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, who doesn't like a surprise dinner? Maybe he was trying to make an effort. So I got dressed, though a little uneasy, but willing to let the past go for the night. When we arrived at the restaurant, I was immediately struck by the lavish decor. The kind of place where the waiters are impeccably dressed and the lighting is just low enough to make everything feel intimate and mysterious. There were candles on the tables, and the air smelled of expensive perfumes and rich, savory dishes. It felt out of place for us, like we were two strangers who had accidentally stumbled into a world that wasn't ours. I tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling creeping up my spine as he led me to the table. He pulled out my chair, his smile still plastered on his face, and for a brief moment, it seemed like everything was okay. Like maybe we could work this out. He ordered the wine, and for once we sat in silence, just enjoying the atmosphere. But it wasn't relaxing. The silence between us was heavy, almost suffocating. Then came the toast. He lifted his glass with a smile that didn't seem to match the tension in his eyes. "To us," he said, his voice strangely steady. I clinked my glass against his, trying to force a smile. "To us," I echoed. As I took a sip, I noticed something. The wine tasted too smooth, too sweet. I'm no expert, but something about the way it slid down my throat didn't feel right. My mind brushed it off, thinking it was just a rare bottle, some fancy vintage I didn't know about. But then the sensation started, a warmth that spread through my chest and down to my stomach, too quick and too overwhelming. I set the glass down, trying to keep my composure. But the warmth kept spreading, turning into a burning sensation that made my head swim. My breathing quickened, and I blinked several times, trying to clear the fog that seemed to be descending on my mind. I reached for my napkin to dab my forehead, but my hands were trembling, not from the cold but from something else. His eyes never left me. "Are you okay?" His voice sounded normal, casual, but there was something about the way his lips curled at the corners. Satisfaction? Relief? I tried to smile, to shake off the unease that was now starting to claw at my insides. I think I'm just tired," I lied, my voice shaky. But it wasn't just tiredness. My body was betraying me, and I could feel myself losing control of it. My vision began to blur, and the room, once so elegant and pristine, started to spin. I reached for the edge of the table to steady myself, but it slipped out from under my fingers. My breath caught in my throat, and panic began to rise in my chest. How could I be so foolish? Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. As I tried to steady myself, the room tilted completely. My head felt too heavy to lift and my arms hung limp at my sides. I tried to call out to him, but no sound came from my lips. My chest tightened as though something cold was pressing against my lungs, stealing my breath. I felt like I was sinking, falling into a void with no escape. His face was still in my line of sight, his eyes wide with, what? Concern? No. That was the mask he wore. The truth was there in the corners of his eyes. A gleam, a flicker of something more sinister. I couldn't fight it anymore. The world spun in slow motion as my body failed me. I had no strength left to hold myself up. My vision blurred until everything was a haze of light and dark. And just before everything went black, the last thing I saw was his face. His eyes locked on mine with a satisfied, almost gloating expression. He didn't care that I was falling. He was watching. Waiting. And that was when I knew. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. A calculated move. He had poisoned me. He had planned this. And I had no idea what was coming next. I collapsed, feeling myself slip away from consciousness. The last thought I had before I lost everything was a sharp, chilling realization. I had been set up. I woke up in a haze, the cold, sterile smell of the hospital room wrapping around me like an unwelcome blanket. The beeping of machines surrounded me, rhythmic and mechanical, like a reminder that I was still alive. Still breathing. Still here. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy as though someone had replaced my bones with stones. My head throbbed, the dull ache a constant companion. My mouth was dry, sticky with the taste of something metallic. My vision blurred as I opened my eyes, the bright hospital lights above me too harsh, forcing me to squint. And then I heard his voice. "You're awake." His voice, smooth and steady with just the right hint of concern. I turned my head slightly to see him sitting beside me, his hand wrapped around mine, his fingers cool against my skin. His face, his familiar face, was etched with what appeared to be concern. At least that's what he wanted me to think. "You scared me," he said, his words thick with a fake softness that I could see right through. "You collapsed during dinner. The doctors think it was just a bad reaction to the wine. You didn't eat anything wrong, I swear." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Bad reaction. I remembered the wine, the smoothness of it, the way it had burned a path down my throat. But I also remembered the warmth that spread through my body, the dizziness, the feeling of the world tilting and spinning out of control. The smirk on his face as I collapsed. My breath hitched for a moment, but I masked it, playing the part he expected me to play. I wanted him to believe I was helpless, clueless. I wanted him to think his plan had almost worked. I wanted to catch him. I squeezed his hand, my fingers barely moving, and let out a soft groan, like I was still struggling to comprehend what had happened. "What happened to me?" I asked, feigning confusion. He nodded, his face tight like he had just taken a deep breath of relief. "It was the wine. Just an unfortunate reaction," they said. "You'll be fine, I promise." I nodded slowly, pretending to believe him, though I knew better. I could feel the weight of his words, but there was something in his eyes. A flicker of emotion that didn't quite match the calmness of his tone. Relief? Guilt? No, it was something else. He had expected this. He had planned it. I closed my eyes for a moment, pretending to drift back to sleep, but my mind was racing. The room spun behind my eyelids, memories flooding my consciousness like a rising tide. He had poisoned me. I knew that now. I didn't need a doctor's diagnosis to tell me that. The strange sweetness of the wine, the warmth spreading too quickly, the dizziness, it all pointed to one thing. He had planned to kill me. But why? Why no? We hadn't been close in months, our marriage reduced to nothing but a cold, distant routine. The questions swirled in my mind, but I couldn't let them take over just yet. I had to think clearly. I had to be careful. He still believed I was the same woman he could control. The woman he thought was weak. As I lay there trying to steady my breath, I heard him shift in his chair. "Don't worry," he said again, his voice too soft now, a touch of sweetness that didn't belong. "The doctor said you'll be out of here soon. Just a little rest and you'll be good as new. I'm just glad you're okay." Glad? No. He was relieved. He thought his plan had worked. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but I stayed still, eyes closed, fingers twitching just slightly under his touch. Inside, my mind was buzzing with the realization that I wasn't the only one playing this game. He was too comfortable, too confident. He thought he had succeeded. I had to keep pretending. I had to give him nothing, no clues, no slip-ups. I had to let him think he was still in control. That was the only way I could catch him. And the more I let him believe it, the more the trap would close around him. My body felt like a prison, but I forced myself to stay still, to breathe slowly. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me panic. He was the one who should be scared now. The door to my room opened slowly and a doctor walked in, his face obscured by a mask. I blinked and watched as he glanced at my chart, making quick notes on a clipboard. His movements were methodical, clinical, as if he had been through this exact routine 1,000 times before. He paused for a moment, eyeing my vitals on the machine beside me. "Feeling all right?" the doctor asked, his voice neutral, almost detached. I nodded weakly, forcing my voice out in a raspy whisper. "Yes, just tired." Good, the doctor said, scribbling something down. "The symptoms you're experiencing seem consistent with an allergic reaction or perhaps an intolerance to something you ingested. But it's nothing serious. Just rest and hydration." His words sounded hollow, like a rehearsed line. But what caught my attention wasn't what he said, it was the way he said it. The brief glance he shot my husband as he mentioned the allergic reaction. There was something almost cautious in his eyes. I caught it, just a fleeting second of doubt in his expression. Was he just being careful, or did he suspect something? Was there something about me, about my condition, that didn't quite fit the story? I watched him for a moment, my mind ticking over every word he said. He was professional, yet there was something else. Was he playing along with my husband's narrative? Or did he know something I didn't? As the doctor turned to leave, I shifted slightly in the bed, my gaze lingering on the door. The subtle exchange between him and my husband left me with more questions than answers. I didn't have time to think on it for too long. I needed to focus on one thing for now: surviving. As the door clicked shut behind the doctor, I heard my husband shift again in his chair. He was back to that fake, sweet tone, asking if I needed anything, pretending like nothing was out of the ordinary. His presence felt suffocating, his every word a lie. But this was my moment. I needed to know more. I had to hear him slip up. For now, I stayed quiet, letting the silence settle between us. I didn't move, didn't speak. My mind was sharp, clearer than it had been in days. I could feel the faint traces of the poison still lingering in my body, but the fog in my mind was starting to clear. Slowly I began piecing everything together. This was no accident. As I lay there pretending to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play here. Something much darker than just a momentary lapse in health. I had to find out what it was, what my husband had been planning all along. And I would catch him in his web of lies. In that quiet, sterile room, I made a vow to myself. I wouldn't let him get away with it. Not this time. The moment I was strong enough to move, to think clearly again, I would take back control. But for now I had to wait. The game was just beginning. The morning after the hospital, everything felt heavier. It wasn't just the weight of the poison lingering in my veins, but the realization that I had been living with a man capable of plotting my death. It was as though a veil had been lifted and the world around me felt sharp. Too sharp, almost painful. But I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to be his next victim. I knew I had to act fast. Every moment I spent lying in that hospital bed, playing the helpless victim, was another moment he thought he had control. But the truth was, I was already steps ahead of him. It was time to collect the pieces of the puzzle he had so carefully crafted. My first move was to get my hands on the medical records. I knew the hospital staff would try to brush off any suspicion, claiming the cause of my collapse was a simple allergic reaction. But I wasn't buying it. There had to be more to it. The moment the doctor left the room, I slipped out of bed, careful not to make any noise. I knew I had to be patient, strategic. I couldn't afford to let anyone, including my husband, see how aware I had become. My legs were still weak, but I managed to stand, my body begging for rest but my mind pushing me forward. I asked the nurse for the full medical report under the guise of wanting to understand what happened to me. He didn't hesitate. After all, I was just another patient, someone who had collapsed due to an unfortunate reaction. She handed me the report with a smile, as though she thought it was all routine. But as I read through the document, my heart began to race. The doctor had dismissed the possibility of poisoning, but the words in front of me told a different story. I read the section that listed the substances found in my bloodstream. The details were vague, but it was clear. There was something foreign. Something that wasn't food-related. something that shouldn't have been there. The report said it was unexpected, but I knew what it meant. I had been poisoned. I stared at the paper, my mind racing as I absorbed the weight of what this meant. He had poisoned me. He had planned this. And I had the evidence now, though it was buried in medical jargon and official-looking text. The next step was crucial. I had to make sure I kept this evidence safe. Safe from my husband, safe from anyone who might want to erase it. I carefully took out my phone, ensuring no one was around. My fingers trembled, but I couldn't afford to show any signs of weakness. I snapped a picture of the most important part of the report, the section that proved the presence of an unknown substance in my bloodstream. I tucked the phone back into my pocket and placed the report back in its folder, careful not to leave any sign that I had touched it. I knew my husband would come by at any moment, and if he found me acting suspicious, he might think I was on to him. I had to be smart about this. But with that photo in my phone, I had the first piece of irrefutable evidence that he had been trying to kill me. I wasn't going to let this slip away. Not this time. The next thing I needed to uncover was why. Why had he done this? What did he stand to gain by killing me? That evening, after I was discharged from the hospital, I returned home. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear, anger, but also a strange sense of clarity. I knew he had been planning this for months, possibly even longer. And I needed to know exactly what he stood to gain from my death. The moment he left for work, I went straight to the computer. We shared a bank account, so it wasn't difficult for me to access the details of his recent transactions. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I typed in the login information. I wasn't sure what I would find, but I had a bad feeling that I was about to uncover something big. As I scanned through the account history, my heart skipped a beat. A large, recent transaction to an insurance company stood out like a neon sign. My instincts flared. What could he be paying for now? I picked up the phone and, without hesitation, dialed the number for the insurance company. I pretended to be his assistant handling some paperwork. I asked for details about a policy he had recently taken out in my name. The representative was polite, but when I heard the details of the policy, my stomach turned. $1 million life insurance policy. It was under my name, and the payout would go to him if I died under accidental circumstances. I asked a few more questions, trying to keep my voice steady as I forced myself to listen to the confirmation that this policy was active and that it would pay out to him the moment I was gone. It was clear now, he wasn't just trying to kill me for no reason. He was planning to kill me. The money, the life insurance policy, was all part of the plan. He wanted me gone so that he could collect the payout. Now I had everything I needed to understand his motives. The dinner, the wine, the poison, it was all part of the plan to end my life. But this insurance policy made it clear that his feelings toward me were purely transactional. He had been planning this for months, watching me, waiting for the right moment. I realized now that the affection he had shown me in the beginning of our marriage was nothing more than a facade. He had never really loved me. It was always about control, always about his own financial gain. The realization hit me like a truck. My entire life had been nothing more than a stepping stone for him to achieve his desires. The house, the car, the lifestyle. I had worked for all of it, but in the end he thought he could simply take it from me. Take my life. But he was wrong. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not this time. I knew the evidence I had so far wasn't enough to bring him down. I needed more. I needed something that would tie him directly to the plot. Something that would be irrefutable. And then one night I had an idea. When he left the house for his usual late-night business meetings, I set up my phone in the bedroom just out of sight. I knew he would be talking about me. He always did. He didn't realize how careless he was when he thought no one was listening. I turned on the recording app, placed the phone on the nightstand, and waited. That night I heard everything. Through the thin walls I could hear his voice, low and almost conspiratorial. "She should have been dead by now," he said. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "The hospital messed things up, but I'll take care of it. She's not going to survive this." I felt a chill run down my spine, the final confirmation I needed. He had been planning to finish the job. And then the real kicker came. "The policy's still good. I'll make sure she doesn't survive. The payout is mine no matter what." There it was. The smoking gun. Proof. My husband had been plotting my murder all along. Every word he spoke confirmed it. This wasn't a mistake or a fluke. He had been carefully orchestrating my death for months, all to collect the money. The moment he walked through the door later that night, I already knew. He was going down. The moment I had all the evidence I needed, the weight of the situation started to settle in. I wasn't just planning to expose my husband for his crimes. I was planning to dismantle his entire life. The toxicology report, the insurance details, and the damning audio recording all pointed in one clear direction. My husband had been plotting my death for months. Now I had to play my cards carefully. Every step had to be deliberate. I couldn't afford to slip up. The truth was, I was in more danger now than ever before. He didn't know I was onto him, but I was still in his house, still within his reach. He still thought I was the same weak, clueless wife he had always controlled. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I took a deep breath as I sat down at my desk, my hands trembling only slightly. I couldn't let him see that. I composed myself and pulled out my phone. It was time to contact the authorities. Anonymously, of course. I carefully crafted the message, my fingers hovering over the keys as I considered every word. I had the evidence. There was no reason to wait anymore. I couldn't afford to let him grow more confident. He was starting to get careless, but he still hadn't made the final move. I had to stop him before he did. I attached the toxicology report, the insurance details, and the audio recording of his conversation. Every piece of evidence I had worked so hard to gather was there in a single, undeniable message. This wasn't just a case of a husband who'd fallen out of love with his wife. No, this was a man who had been scheming her death for the sake of money. I sent the message to the police, using an encrypted email service that would leave no trace. The investigation had to be thorough, he had to be caught in the act. After I pressed send, I stared at the phone for a few moments, willing myself not to feel the rush of fear that threatened to overtake me. I had done the right thing, but now the waiting began. I had no idea how quickly they would respond, how soon they'd start digging into his life. But I had to trust them. I had to trust that the truth would finally come to light. For now, I would keep playing the part. It was almost too easy to pretend to be the fragile, confused woman I had been just days ago. In front of my husband, I wore the mask of weakness so well it almost felt like I had become her again. I let him take care of me, let him believe that I was still recovering from that supposed bad reaction to the wine. Every now and then I would mutter something about feeling lightheaded or mention how strange the night had been. But inside I was planning. I was gathering the pieces, waiting for the right moment to strike. He, on the other hand, was growing more impatient. His eyes, always a little too wide now, betrayed his anxiety. Every time he looked at me, I saw the subtle shift. His focus on my health was less about concern and more about the clock ticking down. He was waiting for me to die. He thought I was just moments away from slipping through his fingers, ready to claim the life insurance money. But I could see it in him. Great. He was so wrapped up in the thought of that payout that he didn't notice how much I had changed. He didn't realize that his carefully planned facade had started to crack. He didn't realize that I was already 2 steps ahead. As I kept up the charade, I watched him, listening for any hint that he was getting more desperate. And I could tell he was. The police were working quietly, but I could feel their presence. Every day I waited, I could feel the tension in the air growing, the whispers of an investigation growing louder. I knew the police had started digging into his life. They were checking his financial records, looking for any signs of unusual activity. I had given them everything they needed to start investigating. They didn't have to go far to find out what kind of man he was. As I moved around the house, I kept feeding the police small, subtle pieces of information that could help build the case against him. I never outright confronted him, but when he wasn't looking, I'd leave out little details that could push the investigation in the right direction. I didn't want to make it too obvious. I didn't want him to catch on. So I remained calm, carefully watching every move he made, making sure to let nothing slip. The police called me a few times, asking about different things like his behavior around me, his financial habits, his relationship with his family. The more I answered, the more I realized just how much they were starting to piece together. The dots were connecting. They were getting closer to the truth. And my husband, he didn't have a clue. But as the investigation intensified, my husband began to show signs of impatience. I could see it in his eyes, the desperation growing with every passing day. He knew his plan wasn't going as smoothly as he had hoped. I could hear it in his voice, his attempts to cover his tracks. He started to push harder, trying to force things along. One night, I overheard him talking on the phone in the other room. His voice was frantic. "I don't care how you do it," he snapped, "but I need this done soon. She's supposed to be dead already. The insurance payout is mine, do you understand? My heart clenched in my chest. I had suspected that he might resort to more drastic measures, but hearing it confirmed so openly, knowing how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted, it made me shiver. But I didn't show it. I stayed calm. I let him believe that his pressure was working, that I was just a sick woman barely hanging on. I was still pretending to be weak, still pretending to be the wife he thought he had under control. But I wasn't weak. I was getting stronger with every passing day. And I knew I had one last move to make. He still didn't know that I had already sent the evidence to the police. He thought I was too frail to even think clearly. He still believed that I was just a victim ready to die any day now. His arrogance, his confidence, it gave me an advantage. He had underestimated me, and that would be his downfall. Every day he grew more complacent. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. After all, I had no memory of what happened. I was his perfect victim. Or so he thought. But he was wrong. I watched him move through the house, his usual air of superiority replaced by a thin veneer of desperation. He was getting bolder, more reckless in his actions, but he still didn't realize that I was onto him. The police were closing in. His actions were only pushing him closer to the edge. And when he finally made his next move, thinking he had won, I would be there to expose him for who he really was. The final act was near. The game was almost over. And this time I was the one in control. The moment I had been waiting for finally arrived. I sat in the living room, pretending to flip through a magazine, my hands steady even though my heart was racing. The weight of the evidence was crushing. Everything I had collected, everything I had suffered through had led to this moment. My husband still didn't know what was about to unfold. He thought he had won, that he had outsmarted everyone. But he hadn't. The police were closing in and his time was running out. The door opened and I heard his footsteps as he walked in, his voice light, casual. "Hey, you're still awake?" he asked, a false cheer in his tone. He didn't notice the change in the air, the way everything seemed heavier, more tense. I didn't respond immediately, just stared at the pages in front of me, pretending to read. His footsteps came closer and I could feel the tension between us, thick like fog. That was when it happened. The door crashed open and the sound of boots hitting the floor echoed through the house. "Police. Get on the ground." My husband froze. His face turned pale as he looked toward the door. The officers stormed in, their badges glinting under the harsh overhead lights. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. My husband's eyes darted between me and the officers. It was as if the realization had hit him all at once, crashing into his consciousness like a tidal wave. He was no longer the one in control. The facade he had built was crumbling in front of him. "You?" he stammered, his voice shaky. "You remember?" I didn't answer him right away. I stood up slowly, deliberately, my eyes never leaving his. His desperate attempt to salvage his plan, to deny the truth, only made me more certain of what needed to be done. I took a deep breath, and in the silence that followed, I leaned in closer, my voice low but steady. "I never forgot." His eyes widened, panic flashing across his face, but it was too late. The officers moved in, cuffing him with practiced efficiency. I didn't flinch. The weight of his actions had been building for so long, and now it was finally crashing down on him. As they read him his rights, I stood still, watching the man I had once loved lose everything in the blink of an eye. His desperation was palpable as he was led out of the house, but there was nothing he could do now. The game was over. The truth had been exposed. I watched, my heart strangely calm, as the officers took my husband away. His face was full of fear and regret. Fear of losing everything he had worked for, and regret that he hadn't seen this coming sooner. His voice wavered as he turned to me, his eyes full of disbelief. "Please, you don't understand. I didn't mean to. Please just help me." I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time I felt nothing. Not pity. Not anger. Just cold, steady resolve. He had begged for mercy before, but I had given him none. He had no mercy for me after all. He had planned to kill me for money, and now the tables had turned. He reached out as the officers dragged him to the door, his voice cracking. "Please, you have to understand, I was just trying to..." But I didn't let him finish. I stepped back, and with a final glance at the man who had once been my husband, I turned away. I was done. There was no turning back now. As he was escorted out of the house, his desperate pleas fading into the distance, I felt the weight of everything I had been carrying lift off my shoulders. The man who had once controlled my life, my emotions, my choices, was gone. And in his place I was free. The car pulled away, the officer's sirens wailing in the distance, but I didn't feel relief. Not yet. I still couldn't shake the image of his face, the way he had looked at me in those final moments. It wasn't just fear. There was something else in his eyes. Regret. It was the same regret I had seen in him on that fateful night at the dinner table when he thought he could poison me and walk away unscathed. He hadn't been able to see the truth, not until the very end. He had thought he could get away with it. But in the end, his own actions had sealed his fate. I thought about what he had said to me as they let him out. Please, you have to understand. Well, he didn't get to make excuses anymore. The truth was finally out. His false apologies were empty. He had never seen me as a person, just a pawn in his game. But I had woken up. And now he had to face the consequences. I stood there in the middle of the living room watching the empty space where my husband once stood. The weight of the moment didn't hit me all at once. It was like a slow, quiet realization that began to spread through me, filling me from the inside out. He was gone. And with him the chains that had held me for so long. I had survived. He was arrested for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and poisoning. The charges against him were ironclad, the evidence undeniable. His carefully constructed life had fallen apart, and as the police transported him to the station, the case was already beginning to unravel. The life he had worked so hard to build, his wealth, his status, everything he thought he could secure through manipulation, was slipping through his fingers. And he would never get it back. The world seemed quieter now, lighter. It wasn't over yet, but the weight that had hung over me for so long had been lifted. Justice was being served. And for the first time in months I felt like I could breathe again. With his arrest, my life was mine again. The future that he had tried to steal from me was still ahead of me. I wasn't sure what would come next. But I knew one thing, I wasn't going to live in fear anymore. The life insurance policy that had been the catalyst for all this. He had intended to steal it from me. But it was now mine. I knew how to use it, how to rebuild. I wasn't going to let the shadows of my past control me. I would take back everything he had tried to take, and I would create a new life for myself. As I walked away from the house later that day, I didn't look back. The house that once felt like a prison, a place where every room echoed with the lies he had told me, was now just a memory. A chapter 1 had closed once and for all. I was a survivor. And this was only the beginning. The future stretched out before me, a blank page waiting to be filled. And for the first time in a long time, I knew I would write my own story. The final betrayal had been his. But the victory? That was mine. My husband made me sign a prenup to protect his assets. I agreed without argument. Years later, after he cheated, I handed him divorce papers. And he froze when he realized who really owned everything. The air was thick with tension as I stared at Scott, his face contorted with confusion. He was sitting across from me in the lawyer's office, his eyes scanning the divorce papers I had just handed him. I had expected anger or perhaps frustration, but what I saw in his eyes was something entirely different. Fear. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of uncertainty, but as he read the words printed on the papers, it became clear. His entire demeanor shifted. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the documents, and his usually cocky smile began to falter. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction stir within me. Scott had no idea what was coming, and yet here he was, the man who thought he had it all under control. The man who thought he could manipulate everything and everyone around him for his own benefit. It wasn't supposed to be like this. When I first married him, I believed in us, in the life we were building. We were supposed to be partners, equals. But somewhere along the way he had turned that partnership into a one-sided game, one where only his rules mattered. And I had let him. But not anymore. Before we continue, I just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being part of this journey. Your support means so much. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe. It's free and helps us grow this incredible community. Let's get started. As he continued to read the words on the page, I could feel the tension in my body rise. This was it, the moment when everything would change. The moment when the carefully constructed world we had built together would come crashing down. My hands were steady as I watched him, but inside my heart was racing. I had waited for this moment for so long, The day when I would finally be free, when I would no longer be trapped by his lies, his cheating, and his manipulation. The day when I would take back everything he thought I had lost. I had never intended for things to end this way. The Scott I had married was not the man sitting before me now. Back then he was kind, charming, thoughtful even. But somewhere along the way his ego had ballooned. And when his wealth started to grow, so did his sense of entitlement. It was subtle at first, just little things here and there that didn't sit right with me. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way he started treating me like I was disposable. He had begun to believe that because of his success he was untouchable. But I wasn't blind. I saw what was happening and I knew what it meant. He was cheating on me. I didn't confront him immediately. I didn't need to. The truth had a way of revealing itself, and when it did, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I had found the evidence. Messages, receipts, photos, and they all led back to one conclusion. Scott had betrayed me. But what was worse than his infidelity was how he justified it. When I confronted him, he laughed it off as though it didn't matter. "You'll get over it," he said. "You'll be fine. You signed that prenup, remember?" His words were cold, almost mocking. The prenup, the one thing he'd convinced me to sign before we even got married, was his shield. It protected him, or so he thought. But now, sitting here across from him, I knew the truth. The power was in my hands, not his. He had no idea what I had been quietly doing in the background for the past few months. He had thought I was defeated, that I would bow down to his manipulation and continue to play my role as the loyal, obedient wife. But he had underestimated me, and that was his biggest mistake. As Scott finally looked up from the divorce papers, I saw the panic in his eyes. The smugness was gone, replaced by a dawning realization that he was about to lose everything. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You can't. This isn't possible." His fingers were shaking as he fumbled with the papers, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was at that moment that I saw it. The fear. Not just in his eyes, but in the way his posture changed, the way he shrank into the chair. He had built his empire on lies, on manipulation, on the assumption that he could control everyone around him. But now his carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Don't worry, Scott," I said, my voice steady but filled with a quiet power. "You thought you had it all. You thought I was the one who would walk away with nothing. But you were wrong. You should have thought about that before you started playing games with me." He tried to protest, to argue, but it was too late. The damage had been done. His cheating, his lies, it all came rushing back to him in that one moment. He had used me, taken advantage of me, and now he would pay the price. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't even feel sadness. What I felt in that moment was liberation. I had waited for so long to take control of my life again, to step out from under his shadow, and now I was finally free. The satisfaction that coursed through me was not born out of vengeance, but out of justice. I had been betrayed, but I had also been patient. I had played my cards right, and now Scott was going to learn exactly what it felt like to lose everything. As he continued to stare at the papers, I could see the gears turning in his mind. He was trying to calculate his next move, to find a way out. But there was no escape. His arrogance had led him to believe that he was invincible, that nothing could touch him. But now he was facing the consequences of his actions, and for the first time he realized that he was not in control anymore. For a brief moment our eyes met, and in that instant, everything was clear. I had won. It wasn't just the assets, the house, the money. It was the power. The power to walk away from a life that no longer served me, from a man who had taken everything and given nothing in return. And as I stood up to leave, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. Scott had lost. And I had finally gained back what was mine. The door clicked shut behind me, and as I stepped into the hallway, I took a deep breath, the weight of the past few months lifting off my shoulders. I was done. Scott would never have the power over me again. Not now, not ever. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I had made it. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, I had already claimed victory. I could feel the weight of the years of silence, the years of being overlooked, finally lifting. But how did I get here? How had it come to this point? To understand where I was now, I had to look back at the beginning, at the choices I made, the love I thought I had, and the betrayal that would unravel everything. Scott and I met when I was just starting out. I was fresh out of college, eager, passionate, with big dreams and a small apartment. I had been raised to believe that love could overcome anything, that if you worked hard enough and loved deeply enough, everything else would fall into place. Scott seemed like a dream come true. He was handsome, confident, and had a magnetic presence. The kind of person people wanted to be around. He had that touch of arrogance, the kind that made him irresistible. He wasn't just rich, he was privileged. His family had money and he carried that weight with him in his words, his actions, and the way he treated others. At first it was all about the charm. The dinners at expensive restaurants, the spontaneous weekend getaways, the late-night talks under the stars about our dreams and our future. It all felt so perfect, so right. He made me feel like I was the center of his universe, like nothing else mattered as long as we were together. He had that way of making you believe in the fantasy, in the fairy tale. It was easy to fall in love with him, and I did. Completely. But things started to change as we got more serious. Scott's ambition grew, as did his ego. At first, I didn't notice the subtle shifts. The way he started talking more about his family's business, about expanding his wealth, and how everything in his life seemed to revolve around accumulating more. More power, more money, more control. I should have seen it then, but I didn't. I was too caught up in the dream he painted for me. The dream of a perfect life with the perfect man. Then came the day he brought up the prenup. We had been together for almost a year by then, and everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. He was talking about marriage, about settling down, about spending our lives together. But then he pulled out the paper. I remember the moment so clearly, the way he slid the document across the table with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's just for our protection, Elise," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "You know how important my family's business is. We can't risk anything happening, not after everything we've worked for. This is just to keep us both safe." I sat there, staring at the prenup in front of me, the words written on the paper blurring together. I didn't know much about legal matters, and the way he spoke made it sound like it was the most logical, reasonable thing in the world. In his world it made sense. In his world, where assets, inheritance, and family legacies meant everything, the prenup was a necessary precaution. But in my world, where love and trust were supposed to be the foundation of a marriage, it felt like something was being taken away before it even started. I remember thinking about it for only a few moments, but in those moments I was torn. My instincts told me something wasn't right, that something was off. But my heart, my hopeful heart, told me that it was just a formality, something to get out of the way so we could move forward with our life together. And so I signed it. I didn't argue. I didn't question. I trusted him, and that was my mistake. The years that followed felt like a blur. Scott's business took off, and so did his confidence, his arrogance. The more successful he became, the more distant he grew. It started small, little things like him working late more often or dismissing my concerns about the way he was treating people. But the more I tried to push back, the more I found myself shrinking in his presence. He was the star, and I was just there to support him, to stand beside him and make sure the world saw the perfect couple we were supposed to be. But inside I was fading. Then came the moment that changed everything. The moment I found out the truth. The messages. The receipts. The photos. All of them pointed to one thing: he was seeing someone else. And not just anyone. Someone who wasn't just a mistake, someone who was entangled in his world, someone who was a part of his life that he didn't want me to see. When I confronted him, his reaction was cold, calculating, and dismissive. "You'll be fine, Elise," he said, as if my world wasn't falling apart around me. "You signed the prenup. You know how this works." Those words hit me harder than I had ever expected. You signed the prenup. It was as though, in his eyes, I was nothing more than a footnote in the grand scheme of his wealth and status. I had always known there was a divide between us, the way he treated money and the way I had been raised to view it. But in that moment I realized just how deep that divide ran. To Scott, the prenup wasn't just a piece of paper. It was his way of ensuring that I never stood a chance. It was his way of locking me out of the life he had built for himself, a life I had helped create. But the most painful part was the realization that he didn't love me. Not in the way I had loved him. I had always been his partner, but I had never truly been seen. I had given everything to this marriage, sacrificed my own dreams, my own identity to build something for us. And now I was nothing more than a pawn in his game. And so I began to plan. It wasn't a decision I made in haste. I didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. I wanted justice. The prenup had given him the illusion of control, but I wasn't going to let him think that I was helpless, that I was powerless in this situation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't need him. In fact, I had been the one holding everything together all along. I started looking into everything. His business, the investments, the assets. I consulted with financial experts, digging into the documents, the contracts, the loopholes I could exploit. Slowly, methodically, I began to take control. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I wasn't afraid. I had built this life too, and I would take back what was rightfully mine. The road ahead wasn't going to be simple. But for the first time in a long time, I felt alive again. The love I once had for Scott had faded, replaced by something more powerful. Empowerment. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was a woman who had regained control over her own destiny, and I would not allow Scott or anyone else to take that away from me again. The days following my discovery were a blur. I was caught in a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, sorrow, and disbelief. How could Scott, the man I had built my life with, betray me so completely? How could someone I trusted with everything, someone who had promised to cherish me forever, shatter that trust so effortlessly? It was as though the man I had known and loved no longer existed. What remained was a stranger, someone cold, calculating, and indifferent to the pain he had caused. The first few nights after I found out, I couldn't sleep. I'd toss and turn, my mind racing, replaying every moment, every conversation, every detail. Was I so blind? How had I missed all the signs? There had been whispers, little things that never seemed like enough to confront. His late nights at the office, his sudden distance, the vague excuses for being unavailable. But I had trusted him. I had always believed in the best of him, hoping that the man I loved would be the one who showed up at the end of the day. But now all of that was shattered. Every word, every promise, every dream we had shared felt like a lie. The messages, the receipts, the photographs, it was all too real. I wasn't imagining things. He had been seeing her, and worse, he had been doing it under my nose. And I had been too trusting, too absorbed in my own world to notice. It wasn't just his infidelity that hurt. It was the realization that he had been living a double life, a life that didn't include me, a life where I was nothing more than a bystander. I couldn't bring myself to confront him immediately. Part of me was afraid of what I would say, what I would do if I saw him face to face. So I kept my distance. I buried myself in the work I had been putting off for years. Planning, organizing, and analyzing. I had to find a way out. I had to regain control, not just of my life but of everything else that had been taken from me. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial. He had used me, exploited my loyalty and love, all while hiding behind a wall of wealth and status. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had let him. I had been complicit in my own misery, choosing to believe in a dream instead of facing the reality of the man I had married. It was hard, so incredibly hard, to come to terms with the fact that the man I loved was capable of such betrayal. But once the shock started to fade, the anger began to take its place. I was furious. Furious with him for the lies, the deceit, the audacity to think that I would never find out. Furious with myself for not seeing the truth sooner. I spent days lost in thought, pacing the house, trying to make sense of everything. I was so deeply hurt, so broken, that it felt like my heart was being ripped out of my chest. But as time passed, something inside me shifted. The sadness slowly morphed into something else, into a determination, a resolve that I hadn't known I had. I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to let him walk all over me, let him think that his wealth and status gave him the right to treat me like this. I wasn't going to play the role of the victim anymore. I would take back what was mine. I would take back everything he had stolen from me, the trust, the respect, the love, and I would make sure he felt the consequences of his actions. So I began planning. I didn't rush into anything. I didn't want to act on impulse, not when I had the upper hand. The first step was simple. I had to gather evidence. Not just about his affair but about everything. His assets, his investments, his business dealings. I needed to know everything. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was about gaining control of my own life, about leveling the playing field. The prenup he had convinced me to sign all those years ago had always made me feel small, insignificant. But now it was going to be my weapon. I couldn't do it alone. I consulted with a lawyer, a woman who understood the complexities of divorce and asset division. Together we combed through the details, finding every loophole, every potential advantage. The more we uncovered, the more I realized how much I had been taken for granted. The businesses, the investments, the properties. Everything had been built on my hard work, my sacrifices. Scott had always been the face, the one people saw in the press, the one who made the big deals. But I had been the one behind the scenes, managing the finances, keeping everything running smoothly. And now I was going to make sure that I got what I deserved. As I moved forward with my plan, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of power. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control. I wasn't the naive wife, the one who had been kept in the dark. I was Elise, a woman who had built a life and was no longer willing to let someone else dictate her future. The more I worked, the more I realized just how much Scott had taken from me, how much he had used me. And the more I worked, the more determined I became to make sure he paid the price. But as I continued with my preparations, something unexpected happened. I started to see a different side of Scott. He hadn't come home that night or the next. His absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He seemed to be unraveling, not in the way I expected, but in a way that made me question everything. He was distant, cold, and when he did come home, he seemed more concerned about his image than about what had actually happened between us. He didn't apologize. He didn't beg for my forgiveness. Instead, he acted as though it was all just a minor setback, something that could easily be fixed. But I wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. Not this time. One night he sat me down, his voice shaky but controlled, as if he was trying to convince both of us that everything would be fine. He said he had made a mistake, that he wanted to work things out, but I could see right through him. His words were empty and his gestures felt forced. He was a man who had been caught, but he wasn't ready to face the consequences of his actions. And as I looked at him, I realized just how much I had underestimated myself. I wasn't the same woman I had been when I first signed that prenup. I was stronger now, wiser. And I wasn't about to let him off the hook, not now, not ever. The next day I continued with my plan, more determined than ever. I knew what needed to be done. The betrayal had shaken me to my core, but it had also awakened something inside me, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. I would fight for what was mine, and I would make sure Scott understood the true cost of his actions. The days that followed Scott's cold apologies felt like a slow-burning fuse, leading to something far more explosive than either of us could have anticipated. As he carried on with his usual routine, pretending like everything was fine, I continued my work in silence. My anger had not yet fully subsided, but it was transforming into something more powerful, something more calculated. It was no longer just about revenge for the sake of getting back at him. It was about justice, about reclaiming what was mine, and about showing Scott that I was not the helpless, naive woman he had always thought me to be. I spent the next few days meticulously planning my next steps. I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Every action needed to be carefully thought out. It wasn't just the emotional betrayal I had to deal with anymore. It was the reality of the financial mess he had dragged me into, the weight of the prenup still hanging over my head, and the trust that had been irrevocably broken. My first priority was to ensure that I had every legal and financial angle covered. I reached out to my lawyer, going over every clause in the prenup, examining every detail of our assets. With every meeting I felt more empowered. This wasn't just about a simple divorce. This was about taking back what had always been mine, only hidden behind Scott's facade. I knew the game Scott was playing. He wasn't the type to admit defeat, not easily anyway. He believed in the power of his name, his wealth, and his family's reputation. But what he didn't know was that I had been working quietly, slowly, to level the playing field. I had taken control of the things he had once used to keep me in check. The investments, the businesses, the shares that were tied to his success. They were all now carefully restructured under my name, hidden away, safeguarded from his prying eyes. The more I learned, the more I realized just how much Scott had underestimated me. I had been his silent partner all these years, running the operations of his companies, managing the finances, and keeping things running smoothly. But now I was taking everything that had been built on my efforts and making sure it would never again fall under his control. I had done the hard work while he basked in the glory of the success we had created together. And now I was going to make sure that I got my fair share, everything I deserved. I remember one evening as I was sitting in my office, reviewing the final paperwork before my meeting with the lawyer, Scott came into the room. He was acting like nothing had changed, trying to charm me with that familiar smile of his. But I could see through it. He was no longer the man I had fallen in love with. He was just a man trying to salvage whatever dignity he had left. He sat down beside me, reaching for my hand. "Elise," he said, his voice soft but tinged with a hint of desperation. "Let's fix this, okay? I want to make this right. I don't want to lose you." I stared at him, feeling a coldness settle over me. This was the same man who had betrayed me, who had lied to me, and who thought that a few words could erase the pain he had caused. I wasn't buying it anymore. Not after everything. My gaze was steady, unwavering as I pulled my hand back. "You don't get to fix this, Scott. You don't get to just sweep everything under the rug and pretend like it didn't happen. The damage is done. And I'm not going to let you get away with it." He seemed taken aback by my response, his face flickering with a mix of confusion and irritation. But I didn't care. The wheels were already in motion and I was determined to see this through. I knew that Scott's pride would never let him admit fault. And that's exactly why I had to be smarter, more strategic. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and finalizing all the necessary paperwork. As the day of the big reveal approached, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't the kind of calm that comes from being resigned to defeat. It was the calm of someone who knows they're about to win. I had done everything I could to prepare, and now it was time to execute the plan. I had decided that the best way to confront Scott wasn't through a loud, dramatic confrontation, but through a calculated shock. I wasn't going to throw it in his face right away. Instead, I would let him think everything was still going according to his plan. He would continue living his life, believing that he had time to work things out with me. Meanwhile, I would be sitting back watching, knowing that the tables had already turned. And so the day arrived. I arranged a meeting with Scott as though we were simply going to discuss the details of our divorce. He arrived early, just like I knew he would, confident and self-assured. He still hadn't realized what was coming. I smiled to myself, knowing how thoroughly I had outsmarted him. When we sat down, I let him talk for a while, listening to his pleas, his promises to do better. But all the while I could feel the power shifting. He had no idea that with every word he spoke I was quietly pulling the strings. Finally I interrupted him. "Scott," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I think it's time we talk about the real issue here. The one you've been avoiding." His expression shifted immediately. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to mask the anxiety creeping into his voice. I slid the papers across the table, letting him look at them. The prenup, his business holdings, the investments, everything was laid out before him. But what really caught his attention was the last line of the document. The one that said that I had taken legal control of everything that he thought was his. The room went silent. Scott's eyes widened, his jaw tightening. He looked at the papers, back at me, and then at the papers again. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You can't. This isn't possible." But it was. It was possible because I had thought of everything. I had anticipated his every move, and now I was in control. The assets, the business, the shares, they were mine. And just like that, Scott realized he had lost everything. The man who had once thought he was untouchable was now staring at the consequences of his own actions. I stood up, ready to leave. "This is your wake-up call, Scott," I said quietly. "You don't get to treat people this way. Not anymore." And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving him there to face the consequences of the choices he had made. He was no longer the man in control. That man had been me all along. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears as I stood up from the table, watching Scott's face fall in real time. The man who had once believed that everything from our marriage to his success was under his control, was now staring at the abyss. His face, usually full of that smug confidence, was now pale, his eyes flickering between disbelief and panic. I didn't feel satisfaction, not at first. The revenge wasn't about gloating. It wasn't about rubbing his face in the dirt. It was about justice. About showing him that the rules he thought he could bend would now come crashing down around him. Scott opened his mouth, his voice breaking the silence. This is some kind of mistake," he stammered, his fingers gripping the edge of the papers as though if he held them tight enough, the truth might somehow change. "You can't just take everything like this, Elise." I didn't respond immediately. I let him speak, let him try to make sense of the impossible. The only sound in the room was the faint rustling of the papers in his hand, and the distant hum of the clock ticking on the wall, marking time as Scott's world began to crumble. Every word I had planned, every action I had taken had led to this moment. I had been preparing for this for months, and now it was happening. It was real. The power I had carefully reclaimed, built on years of sacrifice, sweat, and quiet work, was mine again. Scott leaned forward in his chair as though he thought if he could get closer to me, he might somehow bridge the gap between what was happening and the reality he had believed in for so long. You can't be serious," he said, his voice now more pleading than confident. "We can work this out. I'll fix everything. We'll fix this, okay?" The desperation in his voice didn't faze me. It only confirmed the shift in power. The man who had once held all the cards now had none. And that was the point. I had nothing left to say to him. Not when his attempts at redemption were as hollow as his promises had been. He reached out for my hand, a gesture so automatic, so ingrained in his character that I almost laughed. The same hand that had once held mine with affection now tried to cling to me out of fear, trying to manipulate me one last time. But I pulled away before his fingers could touch mine. His words, his actions, none of it mattered now. He had made his choices and now I was making mine. "You don't get to fix this, Scott," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Not anymore." There was a beat of silence, thick and heavy, before Scott's eyes narrowed. I could see the flicker of realization, the dawning awareness that he had lost, not just the battle but everything. All at once his posture shifted. The confidence that had once been his armor, the armor that had made him believe he could do no wrong, was now gone, leaving him vulnerable, exposed. His arrogance, the thing that had driven him to betray me in the first place, was crumbling before my eyes. "Fine," he muttered bitterly, leaning back in his chair, his hands raised in defeat. "You've won. Take whatever you want. But you'll never be happy, Elise. You'll never find peace in all this." His words, though aimed at cutting me, didn't land the way he thought they would. In fact, they only made me feel even more resolute. Peace had never been the goal. Justice, empowerment, reclaiming what had always been mine. That was my peace. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding with adrenaline, and turned to leave the room. But as I reached the door, something unexpected happened. "Wait," Scott called out. I paused, not turning back. He sounded different now, broken. "What about the business, the house, our life together?" I had already anticipated this moment. I had known that the sudden reality of losing everything would hit him like a freight train. But his words, even in his defeat, still carried a sense of disbelief, almost as if he couldn't quite process it. For him all this was just a game where he thought he would always win no matter the cost. And yet here he was, the one who had lost everything. "I've already taken care of it," I replied, my voice cold but calm. "Everything we've built is now mine. I've secured it all." The shock on his face was undeniable. He looked at me as though expecting me to explain further, to give him some form of closure, but I wasn't going to indulge him. This wasn't about closure for Scott. This was about ensuring that he would never be able to manipulate me again. He had thought I was weak, that I was simply his wife, there to smile and stand by his side as he reaped the rewards of his actions. But I had outplayed him at every turn. I walked out of the room, not looking back, the door closing softly behind me. I didn't need to see the destruction on his face to know it was there. I could feel the shift in the air, the gravity of the moment sinking in. The man who had once controlled everything was now at the mercy of the woman he had underestimated. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I felt something inside me stir. It was a feeling I hadn't had in years, a sense of liberation. The weight of everything I had been carrying, the years of doubt, of hurt, of misplaced loyalty, seemed to melt away with each step I took away from Scott and everything he had represented. I had won not just financially but emotionally. I had taken back control of my life, my identity, my dignity. I stood outside, the cool breeze ruffling my hair, and for the first time in a long while I felt like I could breathe again. There were still battles to be fought, still things to be worked out, but in that moment I realized that I didn't need Scott. I didn't need anyone. I had everything I needed within myself. And as I walked away from the life I had once known, I knew I was ready to face whatever came next. The future now in my hands was mine to shape. And I would do it on my own terms. Scott's betrayal had been the spark, but it was my strength, my resilience that would carry me forward. The power had always been mine to take. And now I was free. I stood there for a moment, the night air cool against my skin, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. The chaos, the years of doubt and hurt, and the pain of Scott's betrayal, all of it seemed to dissipate with each step I took away from that house. For the first time in years, I felt like I was walking into my future, not running away from the past. The man who had once tried to control me, who had used me and taken me for granted, no longer had any power over my life. I was free. But as I walked down the street, I realized that this wasn't going to be as easy as simply walking away. Yes, I had taken back my control, my dignity, and my power, but there was still so much to process. The emotional scars didn't just vanish because I had signed a few papers. The hurt, the disappointment, and the betrayal still lingered, not in the form of Scott's presence, but in the wake he left behind. As I made my way to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something bigger, at play here. I had won the battle, but had I truly won the war? In a sense, yes. But there was still a lingering question in my mind. Was this enough? Had I done the right thing, or had I allowed myself to become consumed by the need for revenge? The next morning I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a message from my lawyer, a brief notification about the finalization of the divorce papers. Everything was now official. The business, the house, the investments, they were all legally mine. And for a moment it felt like a dream. The man who had thought he was untouchable, the man who had built an empire off of manipulation and deceit, had been brought to his knees. And I had done it. I had won. But the victory didn't taste as sweet as I thought it would. Instead of feeling elated, I felt empty. For all the years I had devoted to Scott, for all the sacrifices I had made, I had finally severed the last connection between us. The marriage, the business, the dreams we had built together. Gone. But there was no satisfaction in it. There was no joy. It was just an ending. And with every ending comes a new beginning. I spent the next few days in a daze, reflecting on what had happened and, more importantly, what would come next. I had spent so long playing the role of the supportive wife, the silent partner, that I hadn't really thought about who I was outside of that role. What did I want? What were my dreams, my goals, now that I had taken control of everything? It was strange, this feeling of liberation. I had been freed from Scott's hold, but I also felt lost. The person I had been for so long, the one who defined herself through her marriage, her role as his partner, didn't exist anymore. I was no longer the wife. I was just Elise. And that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The days turned into weeks and slowly I began to rebuild. I made decisions that had been on the back burner for years. I started working on the projects I had once abandoned, the ones I had put aside for the sake of the marriage. I reconnected with old friends, ones I had lost touch with in my years of prioritizing Scott's needs over my own. It felt good at first to rediscover who I was, but there was still a part of me that wondered about Scott. How was he handling all of this? What would become of him now? Then one afternoon I received a call. It was from an unknown number, but something told me it was important. I answered cautiously, unsure of what I was about to hear. Elise, the voice on the other end said, and I recognized it immediately. It was Scott's lawyer. We need to discuss some matters regarding the business. Scott is, well, he's not taking this well. He's trying to fight the divorce, the asset division. He wants to make a deal. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. Of course, Scott wasn't done. He never knew when to quit. The man who had been so smug in his belief that he could control everything had now lost it all. And instead of accepting the consequences, he was trying to claw his way back. It was typical, really. The audacity, the arrogance, it was all the same. I considered hanging up, but something stopped me. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. Tell him, I said, my voice steady, that the deal was made the moment he betrayed me. There's nothing more to discuss. The lawyer hesitated, but I could hear the faint sound of shuffling papers on the other end. Understood. But you should know, Elise, Scott is not going to give up easily. He's determined to fight this. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window, my mind racing. Scott might be determined to fight, but that was his mistake. He could never win. Not now. Not after everything. And even if he did fight, I was prepared. I had been planning for this moment for so long that it no longer fazed me. I had learned to trust in myself, to trust that I was capable of handling whatever came my way. The next few days were filled with calls, meetings, and the finalization of every legal detail. The more I spoke with my lawyer, the more I realized just how deeply Scott had underestimated me. He had always believed that the prenup would protect him, that his wealth and connections would shield him from any consequences. But in the end, it was me who had the upper hand. And as each new piece of paperwork was filed, as each new deal was signed, I could feel the last remnants of my old life, of my old self, slipping away, replaced by something stronger, more resilient. Scott's attempts to fight the divorce eventually fizzled out. His ego couldn't handle the defeat, and with each passing day he became more isolated, more bitter. He tried to salvage what he could, but it was too late. His empire, built on manipulation and control, had crumbled, and there was no rebuilding it. Not without me. And as the dust settled, as I sat alone in the house that had once been ours, I finally felt at peace. It was the kind of peace that comes after a storm, after the chaos has passed and you realize you've weathered it. I had won. And more importantly, I had found myself again. For the first time in years, I was living for myself. No one else. Just me. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. My in-laws secretly transferred my husband's business to his ex-wife. They thought I'd cry and leave quietly, but they forgot who actually owned the land it was built on. The night was thick with laughter, the sound of clinking glasses filling the air, and the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. But as I stood at the edge of the room watching the celebration unfold before me, I could feel the weight of the situation pressing on my chest. They thought I didn't know. They thought I was just another wife who'd crumble when faced with betrayal. My husband's ex-wife, with that smug smile plastered across her face, was the centerpiece of it all, the star of the show. She beamed, the picture of victory, while my in-laws congratulated her on her new position, running the company that my husband had built from the ground up. I couldn't help but smirk to myself. They had no idea that I had already won. They thought I was the victim, the one who would cry and leave quietly as they had all expected. But the truth was, they had underestimated me in every way. I wasn't going anywhere. They had just handed me the ultimate power play. First off, I just want to express my gratitude to all of you for being a part of this incredible adventure. If these empowering stories resonate with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It's free and helps us grow this amazing community together. Now let's jump right in. The lavish affair was held at the company's headquarters, an impressive building that towered over the city, with sleek glass windows reflecting the dim lights from the street below. The entire space felt too clean, too perfect, and yet, it was tainted by the laughter of people who had wronged me. The air seemed thick, saturated with greed and betrayal. I didn't need to say a word. I didn't need to make a scene. Everything was already in motion. I had been planning this for months, watching, waiting, calculating. As I took a step into the dimly lit room, I saw my husband's ex-wife, Rachel, surrounded by my in-laws. Her delicate fingers fluttered as she spoke animatedly, her voice high-pitched with excitement as she regaled them with the success of her new role. To anyone else, she looked like the perfect picture of accomplishment. But to me, she was nothing more than a puppet. A pawn in a much bigger game. And she didn't even know it. I watched as she laughed, her eyes sparkling with the victory she thought she had achieved. She had just signed a deal with the company board, gaining control over everything my husband had built. His family, too, was on her side, convinced that Rachel was the right one to lead the company forward. They had all been so quick to erase me from the picture, to reduce me to nothing more than a forgotten footnote in a tale they thought they had already rewritten. But the truth was far from what they expected. Rachel caught my eye across the room, and for a moment her smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. I watched as her gaze flickered toward the others, seeking reassurance, but there was no need. He thought she had won after all. I didn't even need to say a word for her to know that she was wrong. The moment felt surreal. It was as if the world had frozen around me. The clinking glasses, the chatter, the background music. Everything seemed distant. The only thing I could focus on was the sheer arrogance in Rachel's expression. It was the look of someone who had everything, who believed that nothing and no one could stand in her way. But I knew better. I'd been quiet, observant, and patient for far too long. They had all underestimated me, thinking I was weak because I wasn't loud, because I didn't throw tantrums or make a scene. What they didn't know was that I wasn't the type to lash out impulsively. I was methodical. I planned my moves carefully, calculating each one with precision. And right now I was about to change the game entirely. As I stood there, the weight of their ignorance settled over me like a cloak. The quiet, smug satisfaction I felt was almost intoxicating. They thought I was powerless. They thought they had taken everything from me. But I wasn't the one who had been stripped of my power. They had given it to me willingly. I made my way toward the bar, ordering a drink to steady my nerves. The bartender gave me a knowing smile, as though he could sense something stirring beneath my calm exterior. But there was nothing to say. There was no need to speak aloud when I had everything in place. The pieces were aligned and all it took now was for the game to play out. The seconds dragged on, each one stretching into what felt like hours. I caught my reflection in the polished glass behind the bar, watching as my hand clenched around the glass in front of me. I had always been someone who kept their emotions in check, but tonight, everything was different. Tonight I had a plan, and it was going to change everything. I took a deep breath and turned back toward the crowd. My eyes met Rachel's once again, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of doubt behind her confident facade. She didn't know it yet, but everything was about to come crashing down around her. I had no intention of leaving quietly. No, that wasn't how this was going to play out. Rachel, my in-laws, the board, none of them knew what I had been doing behind the scenes. They had all believed that they could control the narrative, that they could destroy everything my husband and I had worked for. But what they didn't realize was that the land beneath the company's feet was mine. It had always been mine. And I had made sure that no one could take it from me. They had gambled with power, assuming I would be the weak link in this twisted chain. They had failed to see the cards I held in my hand, the quiet strength that came from knowing how to play the game. And as the party raged on, I knew it was only a matter of time before they realized just how wrong they had been. The first move was already made, and now the real game would begin. The taste of victory was sweet, but it wasn't just about winning this battle. It was about something more profound, something more personal. I wasn't just reclaiming what was mine. I was ensuring that they would never forget who I was. And by the time they did, it would be too late. As I finished my drink and set the empty glass down on the bar, I took one last glance around the room. The party continued, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. But as I left the bar, I knew that the tides were already turning. The plan was set and there was no turning back. The game was mine to win. The hum of the party still echoed in my ears as I walked away from the bar, every step purposeful. The air felt thick, charged with anticipation, yet nothing in that room could compare to the quiet storm brewing within me. I wasn't sure if it was the champagne or the burning anger that had started to simmer beneath my skin, but I knew that I was in control. Every smile, every laugh, every congratulatory handshake Rachel received only made the fire inside me burn hotter. She thought she had won. My in-laws thought they had outsmarted me. But there was one thing they didn't realize. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. I could hear my husband's voice in the back of my mind, trying to reason with me, telling me I should just let it go. Let it go, he said, as if that was even an option. How could I let this go? How could I let them think they had stolen everything from me and get away with it? How could I let them erase me like I was nothing? I walked through the party with slow, deliberate steps, my eyes never leaving Rachel. Her laugh was too loud, her confidence too forced. She stood there with my in-laws as if they were all part of the same happy family. They smiled at her as if she was the one who had built the empire from scratch, the one who had kept everything afloat. They were blind to the truth. They couldn't see the puppet strings she was pulling, nor could they understand that she wasn't the one holding the power. She was just a tool, a means to an end. And they were the ones who had handed her that tool, thinking it would get them what they wanted. They had underestimated me. That was their first mistake. I was never the type to lash out. I never yelled, never screamed. I didn't need to. Instead, I was methodical. I played the long game. They assumed I would break down, cry, or confront them in some dramatic fit. What they didn't know was that I had been laying the foundation for this moment for months. I had waited for this moment and I had planned every move. I wasn't just going to walk away from this. I wasn't going to let them tear apart everything my husband and I had built, and I certainly wasn't going to let them think they had beaten me. I stood by the door for a moment, watching them from across the room, and I let the anger settle into something colder, something sharper. The eyes of Rachel and my in-laws were too busy bouncing between one another, too absorbed in their celebration to even glance in my direction. They thought they were untouchable, sitting at the top of the world, basking in the victory they had stolen from us. I couldn't help but smile to myself. They were wrong. They were all wrong. As I stood there, deep in thought, I noticed a few members of the board enter the room. Their faces were familiar, but their expressions were tight, their steps cautious. They knew exactly what was at stake here, and they had a far clearer understanding of who the real puppet master was. I could feel the shift in the room. The energy had changed. There was a subtle discomfort now, and I knew why. My in-laws, they had no idea how close they were to losing everything. I kept my distance from the chaos, letting Rachel continue to bask in her newfound power, unaware that the walls were slowly closing in on her. My role in all of this was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. I'd let them all think they had won, but the truth was, I had been the one pulling the strings from the very beginning. I let the seconds pass, drawing out the suspense until I finally turned and walked toward the back hallway. The noise of the party seemed to fade, muffled behind thick walls as I made my way to a quiet corner. This was my chance to regroup, to think clearly without the noise of their arrogance clouding my mind. I was alone, but I wasn't vulnerable. The room might have been filled with people, but I was the one in control. I sat in an empty office, and for a moment, I let the reality of the situation hit me. This was my husband's business. This was our business. Yet here I was, having to watch it all slip away because of a betrayal orchestrated by people who should have been loyal. The feeling of loss, of betrayal was sharp, but underneath it there was something stronger. Something more dangerous. They had pushed me into a corner, assuming I wouldn't fight back. They thought I was just another woman to be dismissed, to be pushed aside. But they were wrong. I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to fade into the background. No, this was far from over. A few minutes passed before I pulled out my phone, unlocking it with a steady hand. I had already anticipated this moment. I'd been researching, planning, gathering every piece of information I could find. I scrolled through the files I had saved, the documents that detailed the transactions, the manipulations, the loopholes. Everything I needed to take them down. The land. The business. The contracts. It was all mine. The land had always been mine. I had made sure of it. While they had been distracted by their petty power struggles, I had secured what mattered most. My grip on the business, the foundation it was built upon. None of them could take that from me. Not Rachel. Not my in-laws. No one. I exhaled, feeling the weight of my decision settle into my bones. This was it. The moment they realized just how badly they had miscalculated. The calm before the storm. I was playing my cards close to my chest, and they had no idea how deep the hole they were digging really was. Suddenly, the door creaked open and I turned to see my husband standing there, his face a mask of concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with uncertainty. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at him, letting the silence stretch between us. He had no idea what was going on, what was about to happen. He was still caught in the web of their lies, still believing that everything would return to normal. But he needed to understand. He needed to see the truth. I took a deep breath. "They think they've won," I said finally, my voice steady. "But they haven't. They've made a huge mistake. And I'm going to make sure they regret it." He blinked, confusion clouding his features. But before he could say anything, I held up a hand, signaling for him to listen. "This is my fight," I continued, my tone firm. "And I'm not backing down." He stood there for a moment, the silence between us heavy, before nodding slowly. I could see the shift in his expression, the realization dawning in his eyes. Maybe he didn't fully understand yet, but he would. They all would. Soon enough, they would all learn that betraying me was their biggest mistake. The conflict had been set in motion. And I was ready to finish what they had started. The silence that followed my husband's hesitant nod felt thick, almost suffocating. He stood there, unsure of how to proceed, his eyes searching mine for answers that I wasn't ready to give. I could feel the weight of his confusion, but I wasn't about to ease it just yet. The quiet wasn't my enemy, it was my ally. And as much as I wanted to rush forward with my plans, as much as the urge to confront them head-on burned deep inside me, I knew better. The long game had already begun, and it was crucial that I didn't show my hand too soon. "I'll take care of it," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded again, but I could see the questions swirling in his mind. He wanted to ask more, to understand what I was planning, but he knew me better than to push. There was something about my tone, something in the way I had spoken, that told him to trust me. I was in control, and I was about to show him just how much. I turned away from him, needing space to gather my thoughts. The plan was set, and I had to keep my emotions in check. I couldn't afford to let anything slip now, not when everything was teetering on the edge. The next steps had to be calculated, precise. I had no room for mistakes. The business was already crumbling in ways no one else could see yet. My in-laws thought they had it all figured out, but they had missed the cracks that had started to appear beneath the surface. It wasn't just the transfer of the company to Rachel that had set this in motion. No, it was deeper than that. It was the subtle manipulation, the financial missteps, and the hidden deals that no one had thought to question. I had been watching, waiting, and now it was time to move. I pulled out my phone, typing a few quick messages. Each one was a small move, a simple step in a much larger plan. I had connections in places they couldn't even imagine. It was funny how they all assumed I was just some passive bystander in their game. But the truth was, I had been building my own network, gathering the information they so foolishly ignored. I had contacts in banking, in real estate, and in legal circles. And now it was time for them to see just how much power I held. My fingers moved quickly over the keys as I made another note in my calendar. An important meeting that was going to turn everything around. The one thing that my in-laws had never taken into account was that the land the business sat on was mine. It wasn't just some piece of property that could be transferred or sold away. It was my security, my leverage, my power. And they had no idea that I had already taken steps to ensure that no one could ever take it from me. I stopped typing, letting the weight of my decision settle in. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was mine. It was about showing them that I wasn't someone to be dismissed, that I wouldn't just sit back and watch as they took everything from me. This was personal, and I was ready to make them pay for every minute of it. The plan unfolded in my mind, each step more precise than the last. The next few weeks would be critical. I had to keep my movements discreet, keep everything under the radar until it was time to strike. And while my husband remained caught in the web of his family's lies, I knew it was only a matter of time before he saw the truth. The phone buzzed in my hand, pulling me from my thoughts. A text from my lawyer. I had expected it. This was the first step in the series of moves I had initiated. The response was clear. The documents I had requested were ready. This was the leverage I had been waiting for. With the right signatures, the right timing, I could lock down the business and leave my in-laws with nothing. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the realization of it all sink in. The power I held wasn't just in the land beneath the business. It was in the web of connections I had built over the years. Every detail, every conversation, every quiet meeting in the shadows. It had all led me to this moment. They had underestimated me, thinking I was just a quiet, dutiful wife who wouldn't dare challenge them. But they hadn't seen the true depth of my resolve. They hadn't seen the quiet rage that burned beneath the surface, fueling everything I did. I couldn't help but smile to myself. They had made the mistake of thinking I was passive, thinking I was weak. But now it was time for them to learn that nothing could be further from the truth. Every move they made, every action they took was leading them directly into my trap. I stood up, pacing the room as I mentally rehearsed the next few moves. I had been too patient for too long, but now it was time to take the reins. The moment they realized what was happening, it would be too late. My in-laws, so sure of their position, had no idea what was about to unfold. And Rachel, poor Rachel, who thought she was the one in control. She had no clue that I had been watching her every move. She had no idea that every decision she made was being carefully noted, every weakness exposed. She thought she was the one who had stolen my life, my husband's company. But she would soon learn that I was the one who had been playing the real game all along. The clock on the wall ticked, the seconds passing in rhythm with my racing thoughts. I could feel the pressure building, but it was different now. There was clarity in the chaos. I was ready. Every part of my plan was set in motion, and there was no turning back now. The pieces were aligning, and I was going to make sure that when it all came crashing down, it would be on my terms. I heard the sound of footsteps approaching the door, and without looking up, I knew it was my husband. He had been quiet for far too long, and I could feel his gaze on me as he entered the room. I didn't need to speak yet. I didn't need to reassure him, not when the storm was just beginning to brew. "I'm handling it," I said softly without turning around. He was quiet for a moment, but I could sense his uncertainty in the stillness of the room. "I know," he finally murmured. "I just don't understand how it all went so wrong." I felt a pang of sympathy, but I pushed it aside. Now wasn't the time for sympathy. Now was the time for action. "It's not over yet," I said, my voice firm. "But you'll understand soon enough. They've made their move, and now it's my turn." He didn't respond, but I could feel the weight of his doubts beginning to lift. Slowly he began to trust me, to see the quiet strength in my actions. I could see it in his eyes. He was starting to understand that this was my fight too, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I looked out the window, the dark sky looming over the city, and I knew this was only the beginning. The real game was just starting, and I wasn't going to lose. Not this time. The weight of the moment lingered in the air, pressing against my chest like a hand, slowly tightening with every breath I took. I had already made my move. The pieces were in motion, each one falling into place just as I had planned. But nothing could prepare me for the strange satisfaction I felt watching the slow, inevitable collapse of the business they thought they owned. The cracks had already begun to show, and I could see the inevitable destruction looming over them, over their arrogance, over their false sense of control. The next few days passed in a blur, a whirlwind of quiet meetings, phone calls, and strategic moves I couldn't afford to second-guess. I kept my distance from my husband as he struggled to understand what was happening. He had been so sure that everything would go back to normal after Rachel's takeover, so sure that his family would somehow fix everything. He didn't see the storm approaching. And he still couldn't fathom that it was too late to fix things now. But I had known it all along. The warning signs had been there for months. The accounting discrepancies. The strange behavior of certain board members. The rushed decisions made to push Rachel into the CEO position. Decisions made with little regard for the long-term health of the company. I had watched them all, waiting for the right time. And now, the consequences of their actions were unfolding with perfect precision. I sat at my desk, watching the news on my laptop as another report flashed across the screen. Company's stock continues to plummet amid financial struggles. The headline didn't surprise me. I had already seen this coming. I knew exactly how the media would spin the situation. The company was on the verge of collapsing, and no one could blame me for the slow decay. They had done this to themselves. I was just the one holding the cards when it all went down. It was almost poetic, really. They had played the part of the puppet masters, pulling strings and manipulating everything to get what they wanted. But now the strings were in my hands and I was about to cut them all loose. I leaned back in my chair, allowing myself a rare moment of reflection. The anger had started to subside, replaced by a cold sense of determination. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. They had underestimated me for so long, assuming that I would sit quietly and watch as they destroyed everything I loved. But they were wrong. I had waited, and now I was ready to strike. I could hear the faint buzz of my phone from across the room, pulling me from my thoughts. It was my lawyer. He had been with me from the beginning, helping me navigate the legal maze and ensuring that I had every piece of evidence I needed to move forward. I picked up the phone, my pulse quickening as I pressed it to my ear. "It's done," he said, his voice steady and calm. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my tone neutral. "What do you mean, it's done?" "The paperwork is filed. The injunction is in place. The company can't access the land anymore." I let out a slow breath. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The legal blow that would cripple their ability to continue operating. The business might have been bleeding money for weeks now, but this was the death blow. They couldn't survive without the land. I had made sure of that. "You did good," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't need to say anything more. The battle was won. I hung up the phone, the weight of the moment settling over me. I had been calm, composed, but inside I felt a small flicker of triumph. They were finally going to see just how wrong they had been. I spent the rest of the afternoon poring over the reports, making sure everything was in place for the final phase of my plan. The company's finances were a mess, and I could practically hear the board members scrambling behind closed doors. They had no idea how quickly things were falling apart. Rachel, with her false confidence, would be the first to crumble. And when she did, it would all be over. As evening approached, I stood up and stretched, feeling the weight of the day settle into my muscles. The first wave of their downfall had been executed flawlessly, but I couldn't afford to stop now. I had to see this through. I had to make sure that no one could ever erase the hard work my husband and I had put into this business. I found myself walking into the kitchen, the quiet of the house almost unsettling after the chaos of the past few days. My husband was there, sitting at the table staring at his phone. He had been quiet lately, withdrawn, and I knew the toll this was taking on him. But there was nothing I could do to shield him from the reality of what had happened. He had to face the truth just like the rest of us. "Hey," I said softly, taking a seat across from him. He looked up, his expression weary. "Hey," he replied, offering a small, forced smile. "How's everything going?" I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He wanted to ask more, to understand what was really happening, but he didn't want to push. He still didn't know the full extent of what I had done, but soon enough he would. "Everything's fine," I said, my tone even. It's just a matter of time now. His brow furrowed. What do you mean? What's going on? I didn't want to say too much just yet. It wasn't the right time. Instead, I took a deep breath and shifted the conversation. I've been thinking about what comes next. Once this is over, we'll need to figure out what we want to do. He nodded slowly, but I could tell that his mind was elsewhere. I wasn't sure if he fully understood how deep the situation had gotten or if he was just too afraid to face it head-on. Either way, I knew that I was the one holding the reins now. I was the one who had planned this, and I was the one who would see it through. The next few days were filled with meetings, more legal maneuvers, and increasingly frantic phone calls from the board members who still believed they could salvage the company. But they were too late. The foundation had already been cracked. The pieces they had tried so hard to hold together were slipping through their fingers, and I was watching it all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. How had they not seen it coming? How had they thought they could control this? I couldn't help but wonder how Rachel felt now. The woman who had taken everything from me, who had waltzed into my life with her arrogant confidence, thinking she could just take over my husband's legacy. How would she feel when she realized that she had been nothing more than a pawn in my game? How would she feel when she saw everything she had fought for crumble before her eyes? I didn't have to wonder for long. The phone call came in the early hours of the morning. Rachel's voice, shaky and unsteady, filled the silence. "What the hell have you done?" she demanded, her words laced with panic. I didn't answer immediately. I just let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting her stew in her own fear. "You made your move," I said calmly. "Now it's my turn." The business was crumbling. The final chapter was written. And I wasn't done yet. The phone call came earlier than I expected, a shockwave that rattled through the quiet house like a distant storm. Rachel's voice, once confident and haughty, was now frantic, tinged with fear, desperation, and disbelief. "What the hell have you done?" she spat, her words sharp like knives. I paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words hang in the air, savoring the taste of victory that lingered on my tongue. The satisfaction that had been building over the past few weeks finally bubbled to the surface. I had waited for this moment, watched it unfold in slow motion, and now that it was here, I wasn't going to rush through it. This was the moment I had been building toward. "You made your move," I said, my voice calm and collected. "Now it's my turn." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear her heart racing, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she scrambled to process what had just happened. But it didn't matter now. The trap had been set, and all I had to do was wait for them to walk straight into it. "You don't get to do this," Rachel finally managed, her tone laced with venom. "I was promised." "Promised what?" I interrupted, a slow smile spreading across my face. "You were promised a seat at the table, weren't you? A position of power. But what you didn't realize is that power has a price. And it's one you're not willing to pay." I could hear her fumble for words, her panic rising with every breath. She was losing control, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "I'm calling my lawyer," she snarled, her voice trembling. "This isn't over." "I don't think you understand," I said, my voice lowering to a near whisper. "Your lawyer can't help you now. The injunction's been filed. The assets are frozen. The business is over." I heard her gasp, the weight of my words sinking in. The business they had fought so hard to take from me was no longer in their hands. It was mine. All mine. "I've already filed the paperwork," I continued, my voice steady. "And no one, not you, not your lawyer, not your family, can do a thing to undo it. The company can't operate without the land. And without the land, they have nothing." Her silence was deafening, and I could almost see her standing there, staring at her phone, trying to come to terms with the reality of what had just happened. It was over. They had lost. I ended the call without another word, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't help but feel a flicker of triumph, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. I had to make sure they understood the full extent of their mistake. I couldn't let them walk away from this unscathed. They needed to feel the weight of their actions. I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment wash over me. It wasn't about just winning. It was about taking back what was rightfully mine. It was about showing them that they couldn't just waltz into my life and destroy everything I had worked for. They thought they could play with my future, but now the tables had turned, and I wasn't about to let them off easy. As the day stretched on, the company's downfall became more and more apparent. I could almost feel the panic radiating from the board members, the investors and everyone else who had believed they were untouchable. The pieces were falling apart, and the longer they waited to act, the harder it would be for them to recover. I couldn't help but think about my husband. I knew he had to be feeling the weight of everything. He had always been the optimistic one, always hoping that things would just work out. But this time there was no fixing it. This time they had gone too far. I needed to speak with him, to tell him everything that had been happening, to help him see the truth. The past few weeks had been tense between us. He hadn't known everything that had been going on behind the scenes. He had been caught in the whirlwind of family drama, thinking that if he just played his part, everything would go back to normal. But that wasn't going to happen. Not anymore. I walked into the living room where he sat slumped in a chair, his gaze distant. His eyes flickered up as I entered, and for a brief moment, I could see the weight of the situation in his expression. "Everything's done," I said softly, sitting beside him. "It's over." He looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean it's over?" "The business," I explained, my voice calm. "The injunction is in place. The assets are frozen. They have nothing left." His face went pale, and for a moment I saw the realization hit him. The family he had tried so hard to please, the business he had fought for, all of it was crumbling, and he had no power to stop it. "They're not going to be able to fix this," I continued, keeping my tone even. "They can't just walk away from this. They can't take what's mine." He leaned forward, his hands trembling as he pressed them against his forehead. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't have to fix anything," I said, reaching out to take his hand. "I've already taken care of it." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, trying to make sense of everything that had just been laid out. "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you know all of this was going to happen?" I smiled softly, squeezing his hand. "As I was watching. I was listening. I was always one step ahead." He sat back in his chair, a mixture of relief and guilt flooding his expression. "I should have seen it," he muttered, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have known what they were doing." "Don't," I said gently. "You didn't know. They used you. They manipulated you. But now we're free. This is our chance to rebuild." He nodded slowly, the weight of the situation still heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time in days, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about us. It was about our future. The next few days were filled with phone calls, meetings, and frantic attempts from my in-laws and Rachel to salvage what they could. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and there was no coming back from it. They had lost everything they had tried so hard to take from me. And in the end, I was left standing, stronger than ever, ready to take on whatever came next. The business was mine, the land was mine, and no one would ever take it from me again. The final blow had been struck, and it was my victory. As the dust settled and the chaos began to fade, I could finally breathe again. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one that was built on my terms, my power, and my resolve. They had underestimated me, but now they knew better. And I would make sure they never forgot it. I had never seen Rachel so vulnerable. She always prided herself on being the one with the power, the one who had all the answers. But now, as the reality of her situation set in, she was nothing more than a desperate woman clinging to the wreckage of her shattered ambitions. I could hear it in her voice when she called again, her tone quieter this time, a far cry from the venomous threats she had made before. "Please," she begged, her words barely audible. "We can fix this. We can work something out." It felt like a punch to the gut hearing her plead like that. Part of me wanted to take a step back, to offer some shred of mercy, but I quickly pushed that thought away. Mercy was for those who hadn't tried to destroy everything I had built. Mercy was for those who hadn't taken my life and tried to turn it into their own playground. Though this was my moment, and I was going to make sure she understood that. "I don't think you understand, Rachel," I said calmly, my voice steady. "You don't have the power to fix anything anymore. It's over." There was a pause on the other end, a long, stretched silence that felt like it could last forever. I could hear the sound of her breathing, a ragged, uneven rhythm. The desperation was palpable, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "You think you've won, don't you?" she finally replied, her voice low, almost a whisper. "But it's not over. You can't take everything from me." I closed my eyes, a brief flash of anger sparking within me, but I pushed it down. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about power. And I had it. She had no idea what she was up against. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," I said, letting the calmness of my voice hit her like a slap in the face. "You already gave it all away. You just didn't realize it until now." Her silence was thick, hanging between us like a cloud of tension. She wasn't ready to face the truth. She wasn't ready to accept that she had lost everything. And yet here we were. The company that had once been her prize was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "I'll make them sell," she muttered finally, her words filled with a quiet resignation. "I'll make them sell the company to me." Her desperation echoed in my mind. Did she really think that would work? Did she honestly believe that after everything I would let her crawl back into a position of power? That would never happen. I had already made my move and the game was over. I had won and she was just too blind to see it. "You don't have the leverage you think you do," I told her. "You can't buy something that doesn't belong to you anymore." She scoffed, the sound bitter and sharp. "You're wrong. It's my company. It was always mine." I could feel the sting of her words, but I wouldn't let them show. The reality of the situation was that Rachel had been living in a fantasy world, one where she was in control of everything. But now the dream was over and she had to face the nightmare she had created. The conversation ended abruptly, her desperate promises fading into the background as I hung up the phone. The calmness I had maintained was still with me, but now it was mixed with a strange sense of satisfaction. The final blow had been dealt, and all that was left to do now was to watch it unfold. I couldn't help but feel a certain sense of relief. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when everything they had tried to take from me came crashing down. It wasn't just the sale of the company that mattered now. It was everything that came with it. The land, the legacy, the power. I had it all and no one could take it from me. But even as I stood there victorious, a part of me couldn't help but wonder, was it enough? Could I truly walk away from all of this, knowing that they had been so close to destroying everything I had worked for? Was this enough to wash away the bitterness, the betrayal, the loss? The sound of my husband's footsteps broke me from my thoughts. He entered the room slowly, his eyes downcast, avoiding mine for the first time in days. I could see the weight of the situation bearing down on him, his shoulders slumped under the pressure of it all. "I spoke to Rachel," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. She's asking us to sell." I raised an eyebrow, my expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken to her directly before. He had been avoiding it, unsure of what to say or how to handle the situation. But now here he was speaking the words I had been waiting for. "We're not selling," I replied simply. There was no hesitation in my voice. "We're not giving her anything. It's done." His eyes flickered up to meet mine, confusion and uncertainty still clouding his gaze. "But..." "No," I interrupted, cutting him off before he could continue. "You've seen how far she'll go to get what she wants. You've seen what she's capable of. This isn't about business anymore. This is about power. And I have it. We're not going to give it up now." He was silent for a moment, his gaze dropping again as he processed what I had said. I could see the fight in him, the part of him that still wanted to protect his family, to fix things. But it was too late for that. There was no fixing this. It was already done. "We don't need to sell," I continued, my voice firm. "We have everything we need. The land is ours. The business is ours. And no one is taking it from us." He nodded slowly, but I could see the weight of the world on his shoulders. He wasn't as certain as I was, not yet. But he would be. I would make sure of that. Later that evening I sat in the office, staring out the window at the city lights. The sale was final now. The company was mine and Rachel and my in-laws had lost everything. It was a bitter victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up, expecting another plea, another desperate cry for help. But instead it was a voice I hadn't heard in years. "Congratulations," said the voice on the other end, smooth and calculated. "You've won. But let's see how long you can keep it." A chill ran down my spine. Who was this? What did they want? But before I could respond, the line went dead. The room was still, the silence suffocating as I placed the phone down gently, my hand lingering on the receiver for a moment longer than necessary. The voice had lingered in my mind, chilling me to the core. It wasn't just an anonymous call. It was a reminder that in the world I now navigated, Nothing was ever truly finished. Even in the victory I had fought for, shadows still lingered. I drew in a slow, steadying breath, trying to ground myself. The pieces were in place. The business, the land, everything that had been stolen from me was mine once more. And yet something was missing. A deep, gnawing ache still weighed on me. It wasn't the power, it wasn't the company. It was the part of me that had been torn apart when I first realized what they had done. The family I had loved for so long, now standing on the other side of a divide I had built brick by brick. Across the room my husband was pacing, his phone in hand, the light from the screen casting shadows across his face. I had no idea what he was thinking. Was he feeling the same sense of emptiness that I was? Or was he still lost in the idea of what could have been, the family he once thought he could save? I wanted to reach out to tell him it was over, that we could finally move on. But the words felt stuck in my throat. I wasn't sure we could move on from this. The price had been too high. Are you okay? His voice broke through my thoughts, low and tentative, as he finally stopped pacing and looked at me. I nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, just thinking. The words felt hollow, but it was easier to say that than to admit the truth. I was trying to rebuild, trying to piece together what was left of everything I had once known. But the foundation was cracked and I wasn't sure how to repair it. How are you feeling? I asked him, my voice quieter now, betraying the vulnerability I had been hiding all this time. He took a deep breath, his eyes dropping to the floor as he exhaled slowly. I don't know, he admitted. I should feel relieved. We've won. But it doesn't feel like winning. It feels empty. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the unspoken words lingering between us. He hadn't been as involved as I was in all of this, had never fully understood the depths of the betrayal. To him it was still family. To me it was a war zone. I get it, I said softly. But we have a chance now. A chance to rebuild. His eyes lifted to meet mine and I could see the flicker of hope behind the doubt. Rebuild? He repeated, a little disbelief in his voice. From what? From the ashes of what they've done. Yes, I replied firmly, standing up from my chair and walking toward him. We rebuild. Not just the business but everything. We can start over. Together. The words hung in the air, but I wasn't sure if they were enough to fill the empty spaces between us. I had spent so long fighting for everything I had lost, fighting for power, for control, that I hadn't stopped to think about what came next. What comes after the battle? After the dust settles? I sat back down at the desk, pulling out the latest financial report. The numbers were good. Better than I had expected, actually. The company was thriving, and with my name firmly stamped on it, we were no longer at the mercy of anyone else. It was ours now, and I had every intention of making it grow. But even as I read the numbers, a small voice in the back of my mind asked, what's the point if you're rebuilding just for yourself? I glanced up, meeting my husband's eyes again. I know we've been through hell. But we have a fresh start now. I'm not just going to sit back and watch it all fall apart again. We'll rebuild not just the company but our lives. We're stronger now. We've been through too much to let it slip away. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded slowly as if weighing my words, absorbing their weight. The silence between us was heavy, but not entirely uncomfortable. It felt like the space was slowly shifting, the foundation of our relationship slowly beginning to rebuild, piece by piece. I want to believe you, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know if we can just move on. Can we really forget everything they've done? I thought about it for a moment, the weight of the question pressing down on me. Could we forget? Would it ever be the same? No, I said finally, my voice stronger now. We can't forget. But we can move forward. We can let go of the things that hold us back and build something better. His gaze softened as he took a step closer. You're right, he said, his voice low with quiet resolution. We can do this. Together. I nodded, feeling a flicker of something new. It wasn't just about the company or the land. It was about reclaiming our future. Together. We had been through so much, had fought so hard, and now it was time to create something that was ours. Something that no one could take away. As the evening wore on, the weight of the day began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in so long. I was rebuilding. But this time it was for the right reasons. It wasn't about revenge or proving something to my in-laws. It was about us, about creating something stronger, something more resilient. Later that night we sat down at the kitchen table, papers scattered around us as we made plans for the future. There was a new energy in the air, a quiet determination that had been lacking for so long. It was the start of something new, something we could control. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving. The phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. I glanced at the screen, expecting another call from my lawyer or some other business-related matter, but instead, it was an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, but only for a second before answering. Hello. A familiar voice greeted me on the other end. Congratulations on the victory, the voice said, smooth and calculated. But just know, this game isn't over yet. A chill ran down my spine as I listened to the voice, each word calculated, each syllable dripping with a quiet menace. The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the phone screen as it went dark. I looked at my husband, who had noticed my reaction. "What is it?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I shook my head, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. "It's nothing. Just someone reminding me that we still have a long road ahead." He nodded, but I could see the same concern in his eyes. It wasn't just about rebuilding the business anymore. There were still threats lurking in the shadows, and I wasn't sure we would ever be free from the ghosts of our past. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid. We were rebuilding, and no one, not even the shadows, could take that from us. The sound of the phone buzzing on the table broke the heavy silence that had settled between us. I glanced at my husband, who had his eyes fixed on the paperwork spread out before him. His brow was furrowed, a deep sense of concentration masking the exhaustion I could see behind his gaze. The past few weeks had worn us both down, but tonight something felt different. There was a quiet shift in the air, a subtle change in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with the victories we had claimed, or the battles we had fought. I reached over and picked up the phone, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the darkened room. The unfamiliar number made my stomach tighten. Another call? Another shadow lurking behind our freshly rebuilt world? I didn't hesitate this time. I answered it, my finger brushing the screen with calm precision. "Hello." There was a brief pause before a voice I hadn't heard in what felt like forever replied. It was soft, calculated, one I recognized all too well. "Congratulations," the voice said, its tone dripping with faint admiration and something else I couldn't quite place. "You've done well. But let's see how long your new beginning lasts." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my voice steady. "Who is this?" A low chuckle sounded from the other end, and I felt my pulse quicken. "Does it matter? You're on the verge of something great. But you and I both know nothing ever stays perfect, especially when you're the one who's built it from the ashes." The call ended abruptly before I could respond, the line going silent, leaving behind only a lingering tension. I stared at the phone, the unsettling sense that someone was still watching us creeping into my thoughts. "Who was it?" My husband's voice broke through my thoughts, and I glanced up at him. He had put down his papers, his eyes filled with concern and confusion. "Just someone reminding me that we're not completely free yet," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. The words felt foreign on my tongue, but I had to believe them. The world wasn't done with us, not yet. He didn't respond right away, his lips pressed into a thin line as he sat back in his chair. I could see the conflict brewing inside him, the uncertainty that had clouded his mind since all of this started. He still hadn't fully grasped the scope of what had happened, or maybe he didn't want to. It was easier to pretend that we could pick up the pieces and move forward without looking too closely at the damage. "I think it's time we stop looking over our shoulders," I said, finally breaking the silence. "We've fought hard for this, and I refuse to let anyone take it from us now." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for the first time in a while I saw something shift. A spark of understanding, of realization. He nodded slowly, but there was something else in his gaze. A quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. "We've built something strong," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of his words. "We can't let anyone tear it down." I stood up, walking over to the window and looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The night was calm, the world seemingly peaceful, but I knew better now. We had fought battles I hadn't even known I was preparing for, but now we had won. At least for the moment. But with every victory comes a new challenge. I wasn't foolish enough to think that everything would just fall into place. There were still too many forces out there. Forces that had tried to break us before and would likely try again. I wasn't about to make the same mistake I had made before and let my guard down. The land, the business, the connections I had built. It was all mine now, and I wasn't about to let them slip away. But there was more at stake now than just the company. This was about rebuilding our lives, finding a way to move forward, to create something better than what we had before. Together. Turning away from the window, I walked back to the desk where my husband was still sitting. I took a deep breath and sat down beside him, the weight of everything that had happened settling heavily in my chest. It was all real now. The hard work, the sacrifices, it had all led to this moment. It's not over, I said quietly, my fingers tracing the papers in front of me. But I'm ready to fight. Are you? He nodded, a determined look in his eyes. I'm with you. Always. We didn't need to say more. The words were understood. We had spent so much time battling the forces that tried to tear us apart. Now it was time to focus on what came next. As we sat together, planning, strategizing, I realized something. The business wasn't just about making money or gaining power. It was about building a future. A future where we could stand on our own without the shadows of betrayal or manipulation hanging over us. It was about creating something that mattered, something that could withstand anything life threw at us. In the days that followed, we began to rebuild. But this time it wasn't just about business. It was about trust, about family, about rediscovering who we were as individuals and as a couple. The power I had gained over the years wasn't just in the deals I made or the land I owned. It was in the relationships I rebuilt, in the strength I found within myself, and in the unspoken bond that had been forged between my husband and me. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear. But every time I looked at him, every time I saw the flicker of hope in his eyes, I knew we were on the right path. We were stronger than we had ever been, and no one, could take that away from us. The future was ours to shape. The past might have been filled with pain, with betrayal and heartache, but it no longer had power over us. We had moved past it, had grown from it, and now we were standing at the threshold of something new. We didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. Together. And with that, I finally allowed myself to believe, truly believe, that this new beginning was more than just a fresh start. It was a chance to build something that could stand the test of time. A future that was ours, free from the shadows of the past.